Why America scrapped this beast before it could change everything. So 1957, a proving ground somewhere in the American Southwest. A vehicle sits on the tarmac that looks like it came from a different war entirely. It is low, disturbingly low. The turret barely clears the roof of an average car. The entire machine sits so close to the ground that a man standing beside it can rest his elbow on the engine deck. It weighs 18.5 tons, less than half what a Sherman weighed 12 years earlier. Its gun is a 76mm high-velocity cannon capable of defeating any light armor on the planet at combat ranges. It can hit 70 kilometers per hour on road. It can be dropped from a transport aircraft. It can cross rivers under its own power. Army evaluators who watched it move called it the most capable light tank they had ever seen. 3 years later, the United States Army cancelled it. Not because it failed, not because the tests went wrong, not because the technology didn't work. It was cancelled because the men sitting at desks in Washington decided the Army did not need light tanks at all, that the future belonged to heavy armor, to main battle tanks, to the doctrine that said the next war would be fought across the plains of Central Europe, where weight and armor thickness were everything. They cancelled it in 1958. By 1961, the Soviets had put a strikingly similar vehicle into mass production. They called it the PT-76. It would see combat in Vietnam, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. It would kill American soldiers and American-supplied vehicles across 3 decades of Cold War proxy conflict. And whenever it appeared on a battlefield, American commanders would wish, very quietly, that they had something comparable. This is the story of the T-92 light tank, the vehicle America built, proved, and then buried, and how that decision echoed through every war the United States fought for the next 40 years. To understand why the T-92 existed, you need to understand what the United States Army looked like in the early 1950s. The Korean War had just ended. American doctrine was in crisis. The M24 Chaffee light tank was dangerously obsolete, too slow, too lightly armed, and too fragile against the Soviet T-34s it had encountered in Korea. The airborne divisions had no armored support worth the name. Their tanks had to go by ship. By the time armor arrived, the fight was already over. The requirement was written in the aftermath of Korea. The Army needed a light tank light enough to be carried by the transport aircraft of the era, armed well enough to kill Soviet armor, and survivable enough that its crews had a fighting chance. The program was assigned to Aircraft Armaments Incorporated in Cockeysville, Maryland. The lead engineer was Robert Hogg. The timeline was aggressive. The budget was tight. What Hogg's team produced between 1954 and 1956 was unlike anything the American Army had fielded before. The T-92 was radical in its proportions. The entire vehicle was built around the concept of minimizing silhouette. Where a Sherman tank stood nearly 3 meters tall, the T-92 stood 2.14 meters, lower than most of the vehicles it would fight alongside. The turret was recessed into the hull, sitting in a shallow ring so that only the gun and a small observation cupola broke the roofline. The driver sat centrally in the front, prone, rather than seated upright, which allowed the glacis plate to slope dramatically and the overall height to shrink further. The gun was a 76mm high-velocity cannon, producing muzzle velocities approaching 900 meters per second, definitively lethal against Soviet light armor and capable at close quarters against medium tanks. The engine was configured to lie flat, adding almost nothing to the vehicle's height. The T-92 could cross rivers without preparation, propelled by its tracks, for airborne forces dropped behind enemy lines. Not a luxury, but a survival requirement. Test evaluations conducted between 1956 and 1957 were, by military standards, enthusiastic. The vehicle met or exceeded its performance specifications in mobility. Its gun accuracy satisfied the Ordnance Board. It fit inside the Fairchild C-123 provider transport aircraft. The airborne commanders who watched demonstrations asked when they would receive production vehicles. The answer was never. Before we go further, if you're finding this deep dive into cancelled Cold War armor worth your time, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps this channel keep producing exactly this kind of content. The cancellation came from a shift in Army doctrine called the pentomic concept, and it was one of the most consequential, and in retrospect, most misguided decisions the American Army made in the Cold War era. The pentomic army was built around the assumption that the next war in Europe would involve tactical nuclear weapons from the opening hours. Traditional formations would be obliterated by nuclear fire. What the army needed, the theorists argued, were small dispersed combat groups capable of operating after nuclear exchange. In this vision, the light tank had no place. The future was nuclear artillery and the main battle tank as the anchor of whatever formation survived. General Maxwell Taylor, Army Chief of Staff from 1955 to 1959, was one of the doctrine's architects. Under his tenure, multiple light armor programs were cancelled. The T-92 was among them. The decision was not made because the vehicle failed. It was made because the people making the decision had convinced themselves that the mission the vehicle was designed to perform would not exist in the war they expected to fight. They were wrong about almost everything. The pentomic concept lasted approximately 4 years before it was quietly abandoned as unworkable. The tactical nuclear battlefield never materialized. The wars that America actually fought in Vietnam, in Grenada, in Panama, in Somalia, were exactly the kind of conflicts where a light, fast, airmobile armored vehicle would have changed the calculus of engagement. The airborne divisions spent the next 4 decades deploying into combat with inadequate armored support, improvising solutions from vehicles never designed for the role. The PT-76 was a Soviet amphibious light tank that entered production in 1952 and reached frontline units by 1956. The same years the T-92 was being evaluated in the American Southwest. The visual similarity between the two vehicles is not accidental. Both were responding to the same military logic. Armies need light armored vehicles that can move fast, cross water, deploy by air, and provide firepower where main battle tanks cannot go. The Soviets reached the same conclusion the American engineers had reached. They acted on it. America did not. On the night of February 6, 1968, at the Battle of Lang Vei in Vietnam, PT-76 tanks of the North Vietnamese Army overran a Special Forces camp while the American defenders had no armored response. The camp fell. American casualties were severe. The after-action report noted, with careful military neutrality, that the defenders had no anti-armor assets adequate to stop the attacking armor. It was not the last time. PT-76S appeared in the Easter Offensive of 1972. They appeared wherever the North Vietnamese wanted to break a position that infantry alone could not reduce. And every time they appeared, the absence of any comparable American light tank in the theater was felt by the men on the ground in a way that doctrine papers written in Washington offices never had to confront. The American Army's eventual response was the M551 Sheridan, a light tank that entered service in 1969, 11 years after the T-92 was cancelled, with a gun missile system so problematic that crews mistrusted it throughout its service life. Its aluminum hull was vulnerable to mines and RPG fire, its ammunition unreliable in tropical heat. The T-92, had it entered production, would have been in service a decade earlier, proven, understood, and present at Lang Vei when the PT-76 came through the wire. They did not. The Soviet Union built over 7,000 PT-76. They served in 29 countries. They saw combat on 4 continents. The last confirmed major engagement involving a PT-76 was in the early 2000s, outlasting the Soviet Union that built it, outlasting the Cold War that spawned it, outlasting every American light tank program that followed by the time the last operational users finally retired them. 7,000 vehicles. Half a century of combat use, built because the Soviets decided light tanks had a future. One cancelled program in a Maryland archive, because the Americans decided they did not. No T-92 is publicly displayed today. No surviving example sits in any military museum. 2 prototypes were built. Their fate is unclear, as at least one was scrapped. The vehicle that might have been in service by 1960 exists now only in technical documents and faded photographs from a proving ground in 1957, where it sits low in the dust, its gun elevated slightly, its silhouette so flat and purposeful that it almost looks like it already knows what is about to happen to it. There are weapons that fail their tests and deserve to be cancelled, and there are weapons that pass their tests, feel a genuine need, and get cancelled anyway. Not because they were wrong, but because the people responsible for them stopped thinking about the actual wars soldiers fight and started thinking about the theoretical wars strategists imagine. The T-92 passed its tests. The need did not disappear when the program was cancelled. It appeared again in Vietnam, in Grenada, in Panama, in Somalia. Everywhere the airborne was asked to go fast and found that the armor could not follow. The Soviets built the PT-76 and called it a strategic asset. The Americans built the T-92 and called it unnecessary.